2023, at the annual general meeting of the Young Academy of Europe and the joint YAE and Academia Europea Building Bridges Conference in Munich, the YAE awarded the André Mischke YAE Prize for Science and Policy to Professor Renaud Jolivet from Maastricht University. On this occasion, I interviewed the awardee about his scientific and science policy-related activities, goals, and visions. Welcome everyone on this podcast of the Young Academy of Europe, and welcome Renaud, and thanks for being with us today. I am Katalin Solymosi, the chair of the Young Academy of Europe. First, I would like to congratulate you, Renaud, for the prize, which was named after the first chair of the Young Academy of Europe, the late André Mischke, and which is relatively unique in its aim to recognize researchers who are excelling both in science and in science policy at an international level. In this interview, we will hear a little bit about how you came to work in science policy and some of your ambitions for science policy.
Hello. Well, thank you for this opportunity and thank you for the award. I'm very honored of having received this prize.
As a first question, could you describe your background? How did you come to be a researcher, and which twists and turns took you to this point in your career?
So I was always fascinated by science already when I was a kid. I grew up in Switzerland. And then I went to university to study physics, and then I switched to neuroscience. After that, I did, I think for what is quite typical for people of my generation, almost a decade of postdocs in Switzerland and in the UK, with some stays in Japan. And then I landed my first faculty job back in Switzerland. And after almost 6 years in Switzerland in this first faculty job, I had two offers to move abroad again. And I moved to Maastricht University, where I'm currently a full professor and chair of neural engineering and computation. And as I said, I can't quite remember how or when I decided to become a researcher. I'm a first-generation academic. There was no one around me had gone to university or knew how to become a researcher. But I read a lot of science fiction, a lot of popular science books when I was a teenager. And so it seemed like a natural path to me at an early age to want to become a scientist, and in particular a physicist. I wanted to become a cosmologist. And I grew up close to CERN, the particle physics laboratory, where I later worked. And at that time at CERN, there were regular science outreach evening lectures every now and then. And my parents drove me there on several occasions. And that was really, I think, what maybe consolidated my interest for science and for becoming a physicist. And higher education is really accessible in Switzerland, so that made it easy for me to go to university. So I think that's how I got there, basically.
You gave an excellent and inspiring talk at the Building Bridges conference about your research related to the neuronal network in the brain. How did you choose neurobiology as your major topic?
I didn't really choose neurobiology. That was a bit accidental. So as I mentioned, I wanted to become a cosmologist, but while I was a physics student, I sort of fell out of love with astronomy and cosmology, and fell in love with the interface between physics and biology. And it was a bit accidental. So I had applied for a number of, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, except that I knew that I wanted to work at this interface. And I applied for a number of PhD positions. And in the end, I picked this a PhD position in neuroscience, but that wasn't really a very active, conscious choice. Like then I think many things later in my career, there were a lot of accidental encounters and accidents that led me to where I am.
What are the most important scientific questions you have worked with or intend to work with in the future?
So in neuroscience, I think that there's one question that I'm fascinated about since basically halfway through my PhD, more or less. I didn't work on that while I was doing my PhD, but that question is really the role of non-neuronal cells in the brain. And I think it's a really possibly the most important question in neuroscience today, because in the human brain we have about the human brain consists of about half neurons and half non-neuronal cells. And in the cortex, the ratio is 4:1. So there's 4 times more non-neuronal cells than there are neurons. And I think we have a pretty decent understanding of how neurons operate and communicate. At least I think we know most of the basis. By contrast, we know far less about non-neuronal cells, and there is mounting evidence that they are crucial for understanding the brain. They are also absolutely essential for understanding pathologies. And I'm convinced that this is really the great question of our time in neuroscience. There's also an interesting link to artificial intelligence in the sense that we know that the brain is capable of or we know what the brain is capable of, but we fail to understand how neurons and non-neuronal cells contribute together to learning and cognition. And I think that, if we were able to at least start to address this question, this would also lead us potentially to the design of better performing AI systems. And because at the moment, they mostly mimic the brain as a big neural network. And a lot of neuroscientists even think of the brain as a big neural network, but I really think it's a mistake. We have to really be more exhaustive and look at the brain holistically, and really look at all the components of it if we have to understand, or if we ever hope to understand how it works or how it gets sick. So that's what I'm planning to work on in the next decades.
If you had all the money, instrumentation, and stuff necessary to do it, which scientific question would you try to answer first?
So I would try to answer. I would try to work on that question, the question I mentioned earlier. So the role of non-neuronal cells. If all of the money and instrumentation and staff were available, I would advocate for the creation of a big research center in Europe at the interface between neuroscience and AI, and which would really embrace the brain in all its complexity rather than seeing it as merely a big neural network. And some kind of so I mentioned that I worked at CERN at some point in my career. So some kind of a CERN kind of model, but for neuroscience. So a big research center with a lot of infrastructure where people, scientists in the field, but also in adjacent fields, can come and work together. And that really made wonders for particle physics. It was actually necessary because of the cost of the infrastructures. And I think neuroscience is at the edge of a transition phase towards more complex and more expensive kind of research. That's the only way I think we can really address the complexity of the brain, is by working together. And so I think this is something I've been advocating for a while, that we need the creation in Europe of a large research center dedicated to this field. And our competitors in North America and China have already taken steps towards such initiatives. And I'm concerned that in Europe we are increasingly lagging behind these new models of doing biomedical research at scale.
I hope that your voice will be heard. Now let's move from pure science to science policy. What was your major motivation to become involved in science policy? What is your experience in this field?
So as I mentioned, I'm a first-generation academic. And when I was a postdoc in the UK, I promised myself that if I would ever make it to a faculty position, I would invest some of my time mentoring early career researchers. And this was really driven by the realization that being a first-generation academic comes with its own set of struggles and challenges. And basically, no one can really help you. If you don't have a mentor, no one can really help you navigate the unwritten rules of academia, and which was the case for me. And I think that we are probably all aware that, or aware that there are a number of unwritten rules in academia. It's not sufficient to be an excellent scientist. One has to also actively manage one's career. And so because of this, I had benefited from Marie Sklodowska Curie Action postdoctoral fellowship to go to the UK. And I had joined the Marie Curie Alumni Association when it was created in or around 2014, I think. And I decided to get involved in that association and to try to promote career mentoring for early career researchers. And so that was my initial motivation. But then, as I got more and more involved in the association, that sort of took a life of its own. And I became involved in more and more issues in science policy. And I discovered this world and became involved in a number of other issues that I was interested in. So I went on to serve in the board of the Marie Curie Alumni Association, where I was elected. Then in the board of the Initiative for Science in Europe, which is a science advocacy organization based in Strasbourg. And later I was appointed by my colleagues as the representative or stakeholder representative for individual researchers and innovators in the European Commission European Research Area Forum, which is the forum where the Commission, the member states, and the stakeholder organizations debate and shape science policy in Europe, which was created 2.5 years ago. So I've been active in that capacity for 2.5 years. And recently I was made a fellow of the International Science Council, and I'm looking forward to continuing this parallel career at beyond the borders of Europe, let's say.
It was a nice thought and motivation from you to want to help the next generation of researchers. I know how much work it is to be involved in the above organizations, and that it comes with various types of activities or streams of work. What do you consider to be your most important achievement in science policy?
So I think there are two achievements that matter to me. The first one is that the Marie Curie Alumni Association started a mentoring program, and I played a small part in that because I was really advocating for it very early on. That was a proposal that my friend Marco Massia and myself put forward, I believe already in 2017. And it took a few years to concretize. And I really think that this is really important because it's really in a complex career, like an academic career or a scientific career, I think it's really important to have someone you can talk to, you can trust, and who can also inform you on some of the, maybe nitty-gritty details of how careers progress and promotions work and so on. And I'm actually mentoring a number of early career researchers myself, which I think even as a mentor, it's really an interesting learning experience. And the second thing is that our organization was being invited, or organizations, plural, I should say, were invited to send a representative to the European Research Area Forum. And this was a result of a lot of work. So this is the forum where I sit as a stakeholder representative. That was the result of a lot of work by many people over the years. And I'm proud to have contributed a small part to this. And for a number of years, I kept telling my colleagues we are not at the table where decisions are made. So by the time we are aware of this decisions in science policy at the EU level, often it's too late to really shape the process. And I think being able to sit in that forum was really, we made it to the table where at least we can contribute to shaping the process. And I really think it matters today because I think it's really the high table where the European Commission, member states and stakeholders shape the future of European science. And we had the opportunity, for instance, to provide input for FP10, the future framework program of the European Union. So I think we are in a good position now to really contribute.
If you could reform one thing in the academic landscape, where would you start? What is the most challenging issue?
I don't know. There are so many burning issues. It's hard to know where to start from. There are two things I would like to mention, I think. So I think it's clear that there are a number of things that don't really work very well in academia and that need reforming. And I think that you really have to see the historically how the current system crystallized in the post-war period up to now. And I believe so. So one of the issues that I rarely see discussed is maybe the fragmentation of power in the in science policy arena. So between, for instance, the commission, governments, universities, individual researchers, um, it's very difficult to address problems because I think the problems are really systemic, and I believe that we need a complete holistic rethink of how research is performed in academia, because I think the system is not really fit for purpose anymore. And it has also evolved organically, I believe, historically, without necessarily being considered as a whole right from the start. And you see a lot of policy efforts that try to target specific issues here and there. But I think that I often have the feeling that they can only ever be so successful because they are not proposing to rethink the system as a whole, and I think we need a complete rethink of academia, education, and research from beginning to end. So that should include careers, the way education and research are funded at the national and international level, the meaning of degrees, and also the way we communicate science in scientific publications. And these issues, they cannot be disentangled from each other because there's a lot of sometimes weird incentives that are built, and it's difficult then to improve the system by trying to address just one of its failure points. And I think we really need to start having this discussion about how we collectively decide to reorganize research as a whole, and that should encompass really the entire research process, and the entire career and lifespan of academics. And the other issue that I can see that I think is not often very discussed is the lack of involvement of academics in shaping science policy issues. And this is something I've noticed sitting at the European Research Area Forum where I am, is that I'm very often one of the few active scientists around the table, if not the only active scientist around the table. And many of the people who are shaping policies don't actually have a direct research experience, right? And this should not be construed as a criticism of my colleagues within the forum, because I think that they really have at heart to do what's best for Europe, and they bring to the table expertise that few scientists, if any, have. But there is a lack of field experience and field expertise around the table because you have people who have not ever performed any kind of research or innovation, and they are tasked to make decisions about policies around research and innovation. And so I think there's a bit of a disconnect there. And often I feel it's because scientists are not active enough in science policy. And I think that in North America, with big scientific institutions such as the NIH or others, there's a more direct report between active scientists who are in leadership positions and the government and the policymakers at the top level. And so I think there is a model there that maybe we should take inspiration from in Europe to have a tighter connection between politicians who make the decisions and leading scientists.
As someone working as a professor and an independent PI, and also involved in so many science policy related activities, I'm really curious to know how you manage a work-life balance.
At the moment, I think my work-life balance is quite good. That wasn't always the case. I think in particular during my postdoctoral years, I had a poor work-life balance, or very poor work-life balance, I would say. And it was a very stressful period. And I think that's the case for most early career researchers before you get a break to a first group leader or faculty job. And I really struggled in those years to take a break from my work. Now I think it's much better, and I do very many different things in parallel. So teaching, leading a research group, participating in the management tasks of our department and faculty. I do a lot of service and committee work in my research community and in science policy. Um, I think I like to think that I'm quite well organized with respect to how I manage my time, and also how I divide my time between these different streams of activities. Um, and yeah, so I think work-life balance is okay at the moment, but it's definitely not the case. I think earlier in your career, I think it's very difficult to have a good work-life balance early in your career. And I'm not quite sure how we can change this because there is so much competition in neuroscience to, for instance, get a faculty job that until you make it, you can't really relax, I would say. Um, and I think one of the structural problems there is really that we have uh, many people who enter the postdoctoral careers and many more than available junior faculty position. And I think it's really structural issues in the job market. And I'm not quite sure how that can be resolved. Although one must say that anecdotally, it seems that the number of people who enter into postdoctoral careers today has dropped significantly post-COVID. I think it remains to be seen if this is a temporary or a sustained thing. But I think we might be on the edge of a change in the structure of careers because of the individual choices that people make.
Do you have any tips you could share with your peers or postdocs struggling with work-life balance and time management?
I'm not sure. So I think as an academic, you're increasingly being asked to do more and more diverse tasks. I think not all of them are necessary. And so I think one of the first thing you need to really carefully think about is whether you want to invest the time it will take in some of these adjacent tasks. And maybe you need to say no sometimes, or often you need to say no. And if you reflect back on your career, I'm sure you will realize that there are things where you invested lots and lots of energy that never really paid off. It's often I find it's very hard to know in advance which activities are going to pay off, but you need to be a bit careful and not overload yourself with unnecessary jobs and tasks. So I think that's one thing. And then as a group leader, the amount of work or tasks that you have to deal with increases really significantly. And I think you really need to pay attention to what is absolutely necessary versus what is superficial, and also what you can delegate. And I think there's a critical transition to negotiate there, because as an early career researcher, you tend to do everything on your own. Or you are trained. At least that was the training that I received, to do everything on my own. And as a group leader, you need to start delegating. And I think it's a good practice to try to delegate as much as you can, because that allows you to focus the little time that you have on the more advanced and more complex tasks where you can really add value to the team. So in general, what I'm trying to do is to say no to as many requests as possible. Then I always ask myself if someone in my team can do that and learn something from it. In which case I would delegate that task to them. And I try to be careful with this because I don't want to give jobs to my PhD students and postdocs simply because I don't want to do them. So I think it has to be also something that they get something out of from performing these tasks. And then I really aggressively manage my time. So I keep track of where my time goes every day in a big spreadsheet. And I try to regularly review where I've spent most of my weeks, and to try to evaluate whether this compares positively or not to what I get out of these different activities. And I think especially as a PI, you need to be really careful with this because the time is limited. It's your most important commodity, in my opinion. And you can quickly run the risk of losing lots of time in unproductive or unnecessary tasks if you don't monitor how much you spend on these. Yeah, and this has also helped me to develop a sense for when you've spent enough time on a task so that it's done well, but maybe not perfectly too, and you have to learn to let go sometimes. Yeah, so I think that's more or less the kind of time management and strategy that I employ that has worked really well, relatively well for me so far.
One last question that came to my mind. How many hours do you work in a week, if I may ask?
I don't know. No, I keep a record of the time I spend on specific activities, but not necessarily of the overall time I work. I'm not quite sure. Probably 50 hours, something like that, which I think in comparison to some of my colleagues is actually maybe not that much, because you will hear people say that they work 70 or 80 hours. And I think I don't believe that you can be productive in 80 hours a week every week forever. I think you run out of steam at some point, right? So in general, I found to be more productive and more efficient when I limit my working hours to something reasonable rather than trying to work more and more hours. And if I reflect back on the time when I was still doing experiments, I spent an immense amount of time in the lab performing experiments, and it's often very unproductive time. Right, the days are very long, but the amount of the productivity per hour is usually quite low, I suspect, and you just stay because maybe you're gonna use this data. You want to go to the end of the experiment, and sometimes it's just obviously pointless. You will never use this data. There's just not enough time to start another experiment on that day. You would be better off walking out of the lab and go for a walk. But you feel this pressure, and I to stay in the lab and try to make something out of the experiment you've started. So I think we are often, it's often quite unproductive, stressful and unproductive. And in fact, the most productive colleague that I know, when we were both a postdoc in London, she worked from 7 to 5 every day, but she never worked beyond 5 p.m. And she was incredibly productive. She was just very organized with her time, and didn't spend more time than necessary in the lab. And she has been very, very extremely successful. So I think there's a lesson there, maybe.
Thank you very much. I think all of this advice is quite interesting and useful for the next generation of researchers, PhD students and postdocs on how to manage their time and prioritize their tasks. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I truly believe we need more role model interviews like this one and more role models like you. Such interviews demonstrate that some early to mid-career researchers with excellent scientific records are also deeply dedicated to science policy and have invested significant energy and time into trying to change or at least shape the academic landscape for future generations. This is something that needs to be recognized. I am very proud that the André Mischke Young Academy of Europe Prize for Science and Policy is acknowledging the contributions of outstanding young researchers to European science policy-related activities. Thank you very much, Renaud, for the interview, and on behalf of the YAE, we wish you all the best for your scientific and science policy-related further activities.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.